an unsuspecting black couple living in a quiet neighborhood soon finds themselves the target of prejudice and hate. When simple misunderstanding leads to a police call, their lives are turned upside down. But what starts as an innocent encounter quickly spirals into a shocking revelation that will unravel their entire existence, revealing a secret so deep it could destroy everything they thought they knew about their own identities. Will they survive the truth, or will the weight of hatred be their undoing? Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The rhythmic sound of the rain was like a heartbeat, steady, persistent, and unnerving. The street, slick with water, gleamed under the harsh streetlights that flickered as if they too feared the night. This suburban neighborhood, so peaceful by day, felt different now. Every window was dark, every door closed, but something heavy lingered in the air. A sense of waiting, a dread that hung just out of reach, like a storm brewing before it broke. In the distance, a lone figure stood under the shadow of a porch light. Tasha, a black woman in her early 30s, was silhouetted by the light, her face etched with lines of worry. Her breath fogged up the cold glass as she stared out at the rain-slick street, her eyes distant, almost lost. Inside the house, the warmth from the living room contrasted sharply with the cold of the storm outside. The flickering light of a television illuminated the room, where Derek, her husband, paced in tight circles. His large frame seemed to fill the space, but even his physical presence couldn't break the tension that crackled between them. "Do you think they're going to call?" Tasha's voice cut through the silence, brittle and thin. She didn't need to explain who they were. Derek knew. He paused in his pacing, the weight of her question hanging in the air like a stone. His deep brown eyes, normally warm, were now clouded with a mix of frustration and something darker, something harder to name. "They've already called," he muttered under his breath. "And if they haven't, it's only a matter of time." Tasha turned from the window, her gaze sharp as she watched him. "And what are we supposed to do then? Wait for them to show up at our door?" Derek's shoulders tightened. "We wait. We stay calm. We don't give them what they want." He ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure slipping. He was a man who had worked hard to build a life, a man who had learned to be careful, calculated. But here, in this quiet corner of a neighborhood that had once felt like refuge, he was afraid of the unspoken truth that had brought them here tonight, that the peace they'd fought for could vanish in an instant. The knock on the door was loud, sudden, the kind of knock that shatters the calm of the night. Tasha flinched, her heartbeat quickening as the sound echoed through the house. Derek glanced at her. "Stay here," he ordered, though it wasn't a command, more of a plea. Tasha didn't move. Instead, she stood frozen in place, eyes wide, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Tasha exhaled slowly, her chest tight. "I can't just hide in here, Derek. What if?" He was already moving toward the door. "We don't know who it is. We need to make sure we're in control." The doorbell rang next, a shrill sound that jolted the air between them. Tasha opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She was trapped in a moment of fear, her body stiff, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of what could happen next. Her mind raced through the endless possibilities of what might happen when the door opened, but one truth stood clear. Nothing would be the same once they crossed that threshold. Outside, the rain continued to pour, the world dimming under its veil. The steady drumming against the roof seemed louder now, as if the storm itself was urging them forward, pushing them into the unknown. Derek opened the door slowly, his hand on the handle, his muscles coiled tight with tension. He didn't know who was standing on the other side, but he had a sinking feeling that tonight it didn't matter. When the door creaked open, the figure standing on the porch was Mr. Fletcher, the elderly white man who lived across the street. His once pristine shirt was now damp with rain, his face flushed from the cold, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He was the kind of neighbor who always seemed to be watching, his gaze lingering just a little too long when he passed by their house. "What's going on?" Derek asked, his voice calm but edged with wariness. Fletcher didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked over Derek and then to Tasha, who stood behind him, her eyes trained on the ground. There was an unease in the air, something that lingered between them. A moment of hesitation before Fletcher finally spoke. "I heard noise. Loud voices." Fletcher's tone was low, deliberate, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I thought I should let you know. I called the police, just to be sure." Derek's heart skipped a beat, his mouth going dry. Tasha's eyes darted up to him, a flash of disbelief crossing her face. "You what?" she whispered. "You called the cops." Derek repeated, his voice barely above a growl. His body stiffened, and Tasha could feel the shift in the air, the heat of anger radiating from him. Fletcher nodded, his hands clasped together in front of him as if bracing for whatever response would come. "It's my duty as a good neighbor, don't you think? To make sure everything's safe." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy with something unspoken, something neither Derek nor Tasha wanted to name. But it was there, festering beneath the surface. The weight of history, the weight of prejudice, the weight of every unfair assumption that had ever been made about them. Tasha stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "You don't get to make those calls. Not on us." The fire in her words caught Derek off guard. For a moment, he saw the woman he loved, the woman who had fought so many battles, silently and loudly, for herself, for them, for their future. And now, this battle, this was hers to fight too. Fletcher didn't flinch, but his eyes darted quickly to Derek, then back to Tasha. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the unmistakable sound of sirens wailed in the distance. It was happening. The streetlights outside flickered as Derek and Tasha stood in the doorway, the weight of Fletcher's words still hanging in the air. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. But the world outside felt far away, as if time itself had stalled in the wake of that single, loaded question. Why had Mr. Fletcher called the cops? Inside the house, the silence was deafening. Tasha, her dark eyes sharp and wide, stood still, her jaw clenched. She had always prided herself on being able to stay calm, to hold the weight of the world on her shoulders without it breaking her. But tonight, it felt different. The years of navigating spaces where she was viewed as other, where every glance carried suspicion, had built a well of resentment that she had only ever whispered about in the safety of their bedroom. Now, that well had broken open. She was a woman of strength, intelligence, and independence, her beauty not just skin-deep, but reflected in the fire that burned within her. A successful attorney in the city, Tasha had fought for her place in the world, clawing her way to the top in a profession where people like her were often overlooked or undermined. She had faced the walls that society built to keep people of her race in check, and she had refused to let them keep her from her dreams. But all that came at a cost. Tonight, as the cold rain splattered against the window, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her achievements. They felt distant now, as if they had no place in this quiet suburban neighborhood, where eyes constantly judged her and her husband. The victory of their success, the warmth of their home, felt hollow in the face of what was unfolding before them. Tasha was no stranger to prejudice. She knew what it was to be underestimated, to be seen as less than. But tonight, the call to the police, triggered by an old, familiar face, felt like more than just an inconvenience. It felt like an affront to everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Derek, her husband, stood beside her, his strong presence a pillar of support. But even he, usually the calm and calculated one, was visibly shaken. The silence between them was thick, charged with the unspoken tension of a life that had been disrupted. A former athlete turned businessman, Derek was a man who carried himself with a quiet intensity. He had always been the protector, the provider, the one who held everything together, even when the world seemed intent on pulling it apart. But in moments like this, when the invisible forces of racism rear their ugly heads, even Derek wasn't sure what to do. His muscles tensed as he stood there, the same protective instinct that had led him through years of success, now unsure of how to shield them from this. He had always hoped that this suburban life would be different, that the days of being judged by the color of his skin were behind him. But he knew better. The moment he stepped out of a city, he was back in a world that viewed him differently, a world where his accomplishments, his education, his ambition, meant nothing to the people who lived on this street. Tasha's hand reached for his, the simple touch grounding him in the chaos that swirled around them. Her fingers, soft but strong, reminded him of their shared history, their shared struggle. Together, they had faced countless battles. The whispers behind their backs, the sideways glances, the assumptions about who they were and what they could achieve. But this felt different. This felt more dangerous. The feeling of being watched, of being seen as other, had become unbearable. But for Derek, the real question was not about the police. It was about what this meant for their future. What did it mean when the people around them, the ones who were supposed to be their neighbors, were the ones who saw them as a threat? As Tasha stood still, her mind racing, Derek's thoughts were just as turbulent. He knew what he was supposed to do. He had trained for this. As a child growing up in a tough neighborhood, he had learned the rules of survival, how to avoid conflict, how to read a room, how to keep your head down and push through. But as he faced the uncertainty of what was to come, he realized that those rules didn't apply here. Not anymore. The sirens grew louder. In his gut, Derek felt the all-too-familiar pressure of a moment about to spiral out of control. It wasn't just the police that he feared. It was a judgment, the assumption that their very existence on this street was something to be questioned. The idea that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they had achieved, they would always be seen through the lens of their skin color. "Let's go inside," Tasha whispered, her voice hoarse. Derek nodded, stepping back and closing the door behind them. As the door clicked shut, they both exhaled, but the unease in their chests refused to dissipate. The weight of the night, of what had happened, of what was about to unfold, hung heavy between them. Inside, the house felt like a refuge, but it was one they couldn't escape. The shadows seemed to move on their own as the light flickered. Derek took a deep breath, looking at Tasha. She was the one who kept him grounded, the one who always seemed to find the light in the darkest moments. But tonight, even she was shaken. "Do you think this is the start of something?" Derek asked softly, his voice tight. "Do you think this is just the beginning?" Tasha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the living room window, peering out through the blinds. The world outside seemed so distant, so foreign, as if it had moved on without them. "I don't know," she said, her voice distant, "but I'm not going to stand by and let them think they can do this." The police were on their way. There was no turning back now. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, sharp and insistent, like a harbinger of what was to come. Derek's heart skipped a beat as he exchanged a quick glance with Tasha. They had barely settled into their uneasy silence when the unexpected visitor arrived. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. Tasha hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the front window where the flashing lights of the police car illuminated the street outside. She exhaled, steeling herself, then headed for the door. "I'll handle this," she said softly, though the tension in her voice betrayed her calm facade. Derek, his muscles coiled tight, like spring, followed her to the door. He wanted to protest, to take control of the situation, but he could already sense that this moment was slipping away from them. This wasn't just about a knock on the door. It was about something deeper, a shift, a threat to the life they had built. Tasha opened the door, revealing the two officers standing on their porch. One was tall, broad-shouldered, and appeared in his late 30s, his face set in an expression of professional detachment. The other officer, younger with an air of nervousness, shifted on his feet, avoiding eye contact. "Good evening, ma'am," the older officer said, his voice curt. "We received a call regarding a disturbance. A neighbor reported a possible altercation." Tasha's eyes flicked over to Derek, her brow furrowing slightly. She could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the implication behind his words, though he didn't say anything more. "We're fine," Tasha replied, her voice smooth but firm. "There's no disturbance here." The officer nodded, glancing down at a notepad in his hand before meeting her gaze again. "We still need to ask a few questions, ma'am. It's standard procedure." Derek's jaw tightened, his hand involuntarily curling into a fist at his side. He had seen this before, seen how the slightest misstep could escalate into something much more dangerous. The implications of this seemingly innocent visit were already clear. This wasn't just a routine check. This was about perception, about how they were seen in the eyes of their neighbors, in the eyes of the world. "Who called?" Tasha asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. The officer hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Fletcher from next door." Tasha's heart sank. She had hoped it wouldn't be him. The very man who had once welcomed them with a forced smile, always offering unsolicited advice and passing judgment from across the fence. Tasha had been polite, more than polite in fact, but something about Fletcher never sat right with her. The way he looked at them, the subtle ways he distanced himself from them when they'd moved in. She had always felt it, that unspoken distance, the underlying animosity that had simmered beneath his superficial politeness. "I see," Tasha said, her voice colder now, but controlled. "Is that all, officers?" The younger officer spoke up, his voice tentative. "We just need to confirm everything's all right here, if you don't mind." Tasha exchanged another glance with Derek. Her instincts were screaming at her to close the door and end this right now, but she also knew that pushing too hard would make things worse. They had to walk a delicate line. She was used to being calm, used to dealing with situations like this with a cool head, but tonight, she felt the weight of something much heavier pressing down on her. "I'm afraid we got everything under control," Derek finally spoke, his voice steady, though there was a tightness to it. "We appreciate your concern, but there's no need for further questioning." The officers exchanged a brief, unreadable look. The older officer's eyes flickered to Derek, as if measuring him, before he turned his gaze back to Tasha. "We'll need to ask a few more questions." "Just for clarification," the officer insisted, his tone taking on a slightly more authoritative edge. Tasha bristled at the shift in his tone, her patience wearing thin. Derek placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the unspoken communication between them clear. They needed to be strategic here. The last thing they wanted was to escalate things further. "I understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm afraid we'll have to take this up with our lawyer if this continues." The younger officer shifted nervously, but the older one held his ground. "We just want to make sure everything is all right, ma'am. Mr. Fletcher's concern is understandable." Tasha's eyes narrowed. Mr. Fletcher's concern. Right. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she forced herself to stay composed. The officers were here because of one man's word. And that man, the man who had called the cops, was standing right across the street, watching them. Tasha could feel his eyes on her, could practically feel his judgment seeping through the walls of their house. "Listen," the officer said, his voice softer now. "We don't want to make this difficult. We just need your cooperation." A silence fell over them as Derek and Tasha stood at the threshold, the police waiting for a response, their uniforms stiff and impassive. But it was the silence that weighed the heaviest. It was the silence that hung between them all, the silence that spoke volumes about the uncomfortable truth they all knew but couldn't articulate. The truth that they were not just a couple living in a suburban neighborhood. They were a black couple in a space where they had never truly been welcome. Finally, Tasha spoke, her voice cold but controlled. "If Mr. Fletcher is concerned, he's welcome to come speak to us himself. Otherwise, we have nothing further to discuss." There was a long pause. The officers exchanged another look, this time more prolonged, before the older one finally nodded. "All right, ma'am. We'll leave it here for now," he said, his voice colder now, tinged with annoyance. Tasha closed the door before they could say anything else, locking it behind her with a finality that echoed in the stillness of the house. The moment the door clicked shut, Derek let out a slow breath, his fist unclenching. He looked at Tasha, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Fletcher," he muttered, his voice low. "I should have known." Tasha didn't answer immediately. She stood in the hallway, her mind racing as the adrenaline slowly drained from her body. The silence in the house felt suffocating now, heavy with the tension of what had just transpired, the feeling that something irreversible had shifted between them and their neighbors. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not just the cops, Tasha. It's them. It's him." "I know," she replied softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." The following weeks after the police visit felt like an endless stretch of tension, each passing day building a quiet storm. Derek had always been one to keep his head down, to avoid conflict whenever possible. But the subtle, insidious tension between him and his neighbors, especially Mr. Fletcher, was beginning to push him into a corner. The initial shock of the police visit faded, but the underlying resentment lingered like a cold, unshakable fog. He could feel it in the eyes of the neighbors when he passed by. Silent glances, whispers just out of earshot, and the all-too-familiar feeling of being out of place. It wasn't enough for them to just judge. No, they needed to make sure he, and Tasha knew it. Every time he saw Fletcher, the older man's eyes would narrow just a little, as if trying to carve out some deeper judgment. Derek found himself bracing for the worst every time he walked out of his door. He knew it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person in the neighborhood who shared Fletcher's view, a view that saw them as intruders, as outsiders in a place where they were never truly meant to belong. But it was the sudden visit from an unexpected guest that truly shook him. It was late afternoon when Tasha had called him at work, her voice strained, unnervingly so. "Derek, you need to come home. Right now." There was a sharpness to her tone that made his heart race. He didn't even ask why. He knew from the sound of her voice that something had shifted in their world. When he arrived home, the front door was ajar, the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air. It wasn't the kind of fragrance that Tasha usually wore. A soft, feminine scent that felt out of place in the otherwise serene home they had built together. Derek pushed the door open with more force than necessary. "Tasha," he called out, stepping into the living room. He felt a chill creeping down his spine, his nerves alert. She was standing by the window, staring outside, her expression distant and lost. The house felt unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that only comes when everything is wrong, but no one wants to speak of it. "Tasha, what happened?" Derek's voice was low, his heart hammering against his chest. She turned to face him slowly, her eyes not quite meeting his. When she finally did, there was a visible weight behind them, a fear, an uncertainty. "I wasn't expecting this," she said, her voice cracking. "Mr. Fletcher. He brought someone here." Derek froze. "What do you mean?" Tasha took a breath before continuing. "It was his daughter. She came here to talk to me. Said she had to apologize for what happened. She didn't seem to understand how it all looked." "Fletcher's daughter." Derek repeated, his mind racing. "Why would she come here? After all that? After calling the cops on us?" "I don't know," Tasha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But she seemed genuine, at first. She didn't expect me to be so calm about it, Derek." She seemed almost surprised. A cold, prickling sensation crawled over Derek's skin. What kind of game was Fletcher playing now? Why would he send his daughter to apologize, especially after everything that had happened? But before he could press further, Tasha continued, her voice tight. "There's more. She said she wanted me to know something. Something about him. About Fletcher." Derek's gut clenched. "What?" "She said that her father was involved in something. Something that could explain why he's been acting the way he has." Derek's mind reeled. The lies, the tension, the insults wrapped in smiles, all of it suddenly seemed much darker. He needed answers and he needed them fast. The days that followed felt like they had been draped in a veil of suspicion and fear. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break, something that would force them to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Tasha was still processing the encounter with Fletcher's daughter, but Derek could sense the shift in her demeanor. She was no longer the woman who wore her calm as armor. She was the woman who had learned the first real cracks in their world, and the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. "I don't know what to make of it," Tasha admitted one night as they sat on their couch, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if I should believe her." But the way she said it, it didn't sound like a lie. She was scared, Derek. "What do you mean scared?" Derek asked, his brow furrowing. "What exactly did she say?" "She said that her father is hiding something," Tasha replied, her gaze meeting his, as though she was still trying to make sense of it herself. "That something happened in his past, something that could come to light if he keeps pushing things with us." Derek's mind began to whirl. Was this the reason Fletcher had been so eager to turn on them, to push them out of the neighborhood? Was there some larger secret he was trying to protect, something that he felt threatened by? "Do you think it's a threat?" Derek asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Tasha said softly, "but I don't think it's just about us anymore. I think it's about him, about whatever he's hiding." It wasn't long before Derek's suspicions were confirmed. Late one afternoon, he received a call from an unknown number. His instincts immediately screamed for caution, but he picked up anyway. "Derek Turner," the voice on the other end asked, gravelly and unfamiliar. "Who's this?" Derek replied, his heart rate quickening. "I think we need to talk," the voice said. "I've got information on your neighbor, Mr. Fletcher. You're going to want to hear this." The line went dead before Derek could respond. His blood ran cold. He immediately dialed Tasha, telling her everything. Within minutes, they were both on edge, trying to piece together the puzzle. Was Fletcher involved in something darker than they could imagine? And why had his daughter come to them now, offering apologies that didn't feel like apologies at all? As they sat together, grappling with the uncertainty of all, Derek knew one thing for sure. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Fletcher's secrets, whatever they were now in motion, and Derek and Tasha were right in the center of it. The air felt heavier than usual as Derek stood on the worn-out porch of their home, staring out into the street. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, but there was no peace in the view. There was only the simmering tension that had been slowly bubbling up ever since the visit from Fletcher's daughter. It had only taken one phone call to turn their world upside down, and now every second of silence felt suffocating. Tasha was inside, pacing, her mind wrestling with everything they had uncovered. The secret Fletcher was hiding, whatever it was, had already begun to twist and turn in their lives, just like the quiet street that had once felt like home. Derek wasn't sure how much longer he could stand the feeling of impending doom that hung over them. "Derek." The voice snapped him from his thoughts. He turned to see Tasha standing in the doorway, her face pale but set with a fierce resolve. She had been quiet all day, but now there was an urgency in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. "Derek, we need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. He stepped toward her, his stomach tightening. "What's going on?" "I spoke with her again," Tasha said, her breath shaky. "Fletcher's daughter. She called me this morning." Derek's heart skipped a beat. What did she say? Tasha looked around, as if making sure no one could overhear them. Then, she took a step closer, lowering her voice even further. "She's scared, Derek. She told me that her father is involved in something dangerous. And it's not just about us anymore. It's about everything he's been hiding." Derek clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself. What exactly does she mean by that? "She said there's a connection between her father and some powerful people," Tasha continued, her voice almost a whisper now. "People who have been watching us for a while." Derek felt the weight of her words settle on him like a ton of bricks. Powerful people, watching them. His mind raced, images of shadowy figures and hidden threats flashing before his eyes. This was no longer just a matter of neighborhood tension. This was something much bigger. They've been watching us. Derek repeated, his voice barely audible. Why? I don't know, Tasha said, her hand gripping his arm tightly. But it's getting dangerous. She told me that if we don't do something soon, everything could come crashing down. A chill ran down Derek's spine. His mind was struggling to process everything. The fact that Fletcher had been hiding something was one thing, but the idea that he might be involved with people who were watching them, pulling strings behind the scenes, made everything feel infinitely more complicated. And deadly. I don't know if we can keep going like this, Derek muttered, his voice breaking as the weight of the situation hit him. It feels like we're being dragged into something we can't control. Tasha's gaze softened, and she reached up to touch his face. We'll figure this out, Derek. We have to. But deep down, Derek knew they were running out of time. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon was no longer just a distant threat. It was here, and it was closing in on them faster than he ever imagined. The next day, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It was a subtle thing at first, glances from across the street, a car parked too long in front of their house, a figure disappearing just around the corner when he tried to get a good look. But as the hours passed, the unease only grew stronger. Tasha had suggested they confront Fletcher, ask him directly about his involvement with these powerful people, but Derek wasn't so sure. There was too much at stake now, and pushing too hard might cause him to snap. It wasn't the confrontation he was worried about. It was the consequences that could follow. As he walked to the front of the house, he caught sight of Fletcher standing across the street, his cold eyes locked onto Derek's. The moment felt charged, like two magnets drawn together by an unseen force. Derek took a step forward, but before he could say anything, Fletcher's daughter appeared next to her father, her face pale, her posture stiff. Derek, Fletcher said, his voice as sharp as a blade. You should know, this isn't over. Derek's pulse quickened. What do you mean? The older man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smirk, one that sent a chill down Derek's spine. I think you've already figured it out. The people I know, the things I've done, those things don't just go away, and neither will the consequences of them. His words were like a punch to the gut. Derek could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't let it show. You've been watching us. What do you want? Fletcher's eyes flickered to his daughter, who was now avoiding Derek's gaze. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, he said, but you will. As he turned and walked away, Derek felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He had no idea what game Fletcher was playing, but he knew one thing. It wasn't going to end well. That night, the phone rang again. Derek didn't even need to look at the caller ID. He knew who it was. The same voice from before. Derek, the voice said, breathless. This is bigger than you think. Fletcher isn't just hiding secrets about his past. He's part of something much more dangerous. They've already started watching you, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their own. Derek's mind reeled, but before he could ask another question, the line went dead. What the hell is going on? Derek muttered, slamming the phone down onto the counter. Tasha entered the room just as he was pacing, her eyes filled with concern. Who was that? I don't know, Derek said, running a hand through his hair. But whoever it is, they know more about Fletcher than we do. Tasha took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. Derek, this is it. We have to go after him. We can't wait any longer. But Derek could only shake his head. We don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know what kind of people Fletcher is involved with. Tasha's face hardened with determination. Then we'll find out. Together. And in that moment, Derek realized that the only way out of this was through it. The stakes had been raised, and the secrets buried in the past were now pushing to the surface. They could run, or they could stand their ground, but there was no turning back now. Derek couldn't remember the last time he had slept. The days bled into each other, a constant blur of tension, half-formed plans, and unspoken fears. Every step felt like it was taking him deeper into a labyrinth with no clear way out. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the weight of the moment settled in. He was running out of time. Tasha was inside, making phone calls, trying to find anyone who could give them answers, while Derek stood on the porch, staring down the street. The sound of tires on gravel echoed, and for a moment he wondered if it was them. But then he saw the familiar headlights of his neighbor, Mrs. Thomas, turning into the driveway. The sharp, unrelenting paranoia that had taken hold of him over the last few weeks made every small noise seem like a threat. It had been 3 days since the call from Fletcher's daughter, and nothing had changed. They were no closer to understanding what Fletcher was involved in, but they knew one thing for sure. It was bigger than they could handle alone. Derek's phone vibrated in his pocket, and his heart skipped. Another call from an unknown number. It was happening again, just like before. He glanced over his shoulder at Tasha, who was pacing in the living room, still searching for any lead that would make sense of their situation. He hesitated before answering. "Derek," the voice on the other end said, strained, almost frantic. "It's time. You don't have much longer. They're coming for you." Derek's stomach dropped. He had never heard the voice before, but he knew immediately it wasn't a threat. It was a warning. "Who is this?" he demanded, trying to steady his shaking hands. "What do you mean they're coming for me?" The voice hesitated, and Derek could hear heavy breathing on the other end of the line. "Fletcher's not who you think he is. The people he's working for, they've already set their sights on you. You have to move fast. It's already too late for me." The line went dead. Derek stood there, frozen, his mind racing. Every word was a punch to the gut. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. Tasha appeared in the doorway. "Who was it?" she asked, her voice strained. "I don't know," Derek said, his voice tight. "But they're coming, Tasha. They know what we know, and they're closing in." Tasha's eyes narrowed. "We need to go to Fletcher. Get the truth out of him. It's the only way." Derek shook his head. "It's not that simple. Fletcher's not just hiding something. He's protecting it. And whatever it is, it's bigger than both of us." Before Tasha could respond, Derek's phone rang again, this time a text message flashing on the screen. He didn't recognize the number, but the words were unmistakable. "You're in deeper than you think. There's more at stake than your lives. Meet me at the old warehouse at midnight. Bring Tasha." Derek looked at Tasha, his face pale. "We have to go. Now." As midnight loomed closer, the shadows of the night seemed to stretch longer. The air was thick with tension, and every sound felt amplified in the dark streets. Derek's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they neared the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. He had no idea who'd sent the message, but he knew one thing for sure. This meeting was a turning point, a crossroads they couldn't afford to miss. Tasha sat beside him, her eyes scanning the area nervously. "You think it's a trap?" "I don't know. But we don't have a choice," Derek muttered, his mind spinning. "Whatever's going on, it's bigger than we are. We need answers." The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and imposing against the night sky. Derek slowed the car, the crunch of gravel under the tires loud in the stillness. As he parked, he saw a figure emerge from the shadows near the entrance. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie that concealed most of his face. But even in the dim light, Derek could see the faint glint of something in his hand, a gun. "Stay in the car," Derek whispered to Tasha, his voice low. "I'll handle this." Tasha didn't argue. Instead, she reached into the glove compartment, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the small gun they had taken for protection. Her eyes locked with Derek's for a moment, silent understanding passing between them. He nodded and opened the door, stepping out into the night. The figure in the shadows didn't move until Derek was only a few feet away. Then, in a fluid motion, he stepped forward, pulling the hood back to reveal a familiar face. It was Fletcher. "Fletcher," Derek said, his voice full of disbelief. "What the hell is going on? Why are you here? What do you want?" Fletcher's eyes were hard, cold, almost unrecognizable. But as he looked at Derek, there was a brief flicker of something softer beneath the surface. Regret? Fear? Derek couldn't tell. "You should have stayed away, Derek," Fletcher said, his voice low and dangerous. "But it's too late now." Before Derek could respond, Fletcher's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the side of the car. "You're in this now," Fletcher growled. "You don't get to walk away." Derek struggled to breathe, but he managed to catch Fletcher's eye. "You're the one who brought me into this mess. So tell me what the hell's going on." A sharp laugh escaped Fletcher, but it wasn't humorous. It was bitter, laden with regret. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about you, Derek. It's about something much bigger than either of us. You're just a pawn in a game you can't even begin to understand." Fletcher released him suddenly, pushing him back. Derek stumbled, but managed to steady himself, his pulse racing. "What game? Who are you working for?" Fletcher's eyes flickered to the car, where Tasha had stepped out and was watching from a distance, her face pale and tense. "You think you can change things, Derek? You can't. You're too deep. We all are." The words hung in the air, chilling Derek to his core. "What do you mean?" But before Fletcher could answer, a burst of gunfire rang out from behind them. The sound echoed through the night, shattering the tense silence like glass. Derek's heart stopped. He spun around, his instincts screaming as a dark figure emerged from the shadows, gun raised. The night had become an unforgiving labyrinth of shadows, a suffocating weight hanging over the city as Derek and Tasha moved swiftly through the alleyways. Their breaths came in short, frantic bursts as they pushed forward, the sudden gunfire still ringing in their ears. Fletcher had disappeared into the chaos, leaving them with nothing but questions, fear, and the stark realization that there was no turning back. Tasha was silent beside him, her grip on the handgun steady despite the fear in her eyes. She didn't have to say a word. Derek could feel her resolve, feel it pushing them both forward, toward whatever lay ahead. They had no choice. Whatever had been set into motion, whatever dangerous forces were at play, it had come for them, and now there was no escaping it. The warehouse loomed in the distance, an imposing silhouette in the darkness. The very place where it had all started, the place where the truth about Fletcher, about the people he was working for, would finally be laid bare. Derek felt a cold knot in his stomach. This was the point of no return. As they neared the entrance, Derek could hear muffled voices and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. His heart raced. They weren't alone. Whoever had sent the message, whoever had been pulling the strings all this time, had to be here. Tasha reached out and grabbed his arm, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of fear and determination. "We need to be careful. They'll be expecting us." "I know," Derek replied, his voice barely a whisper. His mind was racing, processing every detail, every step. The twists and turns, the lies, the betrayal, they had all led here, to this moment. They reached the entrance, a rusted door that groaned as Derek pushed it open. The warehouse interior was bathed in dim light, the silence deafening. The air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of oil and metal, but underneath it all was something darker, a sense of impending doom that settled over them like a shroud. Derek stepped inside first, his pulse pounding in his ears. Tasha followed close behind, her gun raised. The vast, open space stretched out before them, the remnants of old machinery and crates scattered haphazardly. But there was something else, something far more dangerous lurking in shadows. Suddenly, a sharp voice broke the silence, its edges biting and cold. "Did you really think you could just walk away, Derek?" The voice was unmistakable. Derek froze, his blood running cold. He turned toward the voice, his eyes locking onto the figure standing at the far end of the warehouse, half hidden in shadow. Fletcher. But there was something different about him. The man who had once been a mentor, a friend, was no longer the person Derek recognized. His eyes were hollow, filled with a cold, calculating emptiness. His posture was rigid, almost predatory. "Fletcher," Derek breathed, his throat tight. "You should have stayed out of it, Derek," Fletcher said, his voice low but laced with venom. "But now you're part of this. You're part of something far bigger than you could ever understand." Tasha's grip on her gun tightened. "What the hell is this about? What do you want from us?" Fletcher's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. I don't want anything from you. You've already given me everything I need. He stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silence. You see, Derek, there are people who don't take kindly to interference. People who are willing to do whatever it takes to protect their interests. And you've crossed a line you don't even realize. Derek's chest tightened, his mind racing. What the hell does that mean? You'll find out soon enough, Fletcher said, his tone dangerously calm. But there's no way out now. You're too deep. You've seen too much. The moment you started asking questions, it was over for you. Derek's mind spun, trying to piece it all together. The hidden agendas, the manipulation, the lies. And now, Fletcher standing here, no longer the ally he once was. But it wasn't just Fletcher. The figure behind him stepped forward, revealing a face Derek never thought he'd see here. The person standing next to Fletcher was none other than Mrs. Thomas, the neighbor who had always kept her distance, who had always seemed so innocuous. But her eyes were cold now, calculating, the same as Fletcher's. She held a gun in her hand, and the smile on her face was one of pure indifference. Tasha gasped, "No, it can't be." Fletcher nodded, his eyes glinting. "Oh, it's her. Mrs. Thomas is more than just a concerned neighbor. She's been working with me from the start, feeding me information, making sure nothing went unnoticed." The world seemed to spin as Derek's thoughts collided with the shock of betrayal. Why? Why would you do this? Why would you work with him? Mrs. Thomas's voice was calm, almost soothing as she spoke. You wouldn't understand, but it's not personal, Derek. It's about power, control, survival. Fletcher stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. This isn't something you can fix. The truth is, the game was rigged from the start. And you, Tasha, Derek, you were nothing more than pawns on the board. Tasha raised her gun, her hands steady despite the turmoil within her. You don't get to decide that for us, Fletcher. Whatever this is, we're not backing down. For a split second, the air seemed to still, the tension thick enough to choke. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps. Drop the weapons, a voice barked. Now, Derek spun around, his heart slamming in his chest. A group of armed men had appeared, their faces hidden beneath masks. The odds were stacked against them now, but they hadn't come this far to back down. Fletcher's eyes flickered between the two groups, a dark amusement crossing his features. Well, Derek, looks like your little rebellion has come to an end. But Derek wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. His mind worked quickly, and in the back of his head, a plan began to form. A desperate, risky plan, but it was all they had left. Without warning, Derek grabbed Tasha's wrist and pulled her toward the nearest pile of crates, seeking cover. The sudden movement caught Fletcher and his crew off guard, and in that moment, Derek knew this was their last shot. He didn't know how this would end, but he was damn sure he wasn't going to give up without a fight. The dust in the air settled, and the sound of gunfire still echoed in Derek's ears. His pulse pounded as he crouched behind the crates, Tasha's hand gripping his arm, her breath shallow and fast. They had taken cover just in time, the sudden onslaught of masked men forcing them into a desperate scramble. But now, everything was quiet. Fletcher's voice rang out from across the warehouse. You think you've won, Derek? You're still playing in my game. No matter what you do, it's too late. The words stung like an open wound, but Derek refused to let them break him. His eyes darted across the room, scanning for any advantage. The warehouse was dimly lit, and he could see shadows moving in the corners of his vision, silhouettes of men that had surrounded them. But there was no turning back now. Don't listen to him, Tasha whispered, her voice steady despite the situation. We're getting out of this. Together. Derek nodded, grateful for her unwavering resolve. She was the anchor that kept him tethered to reality in this madness. He had to trust her, just like she trusted him. But the odds were insurmountable, and every move they made felt like a gamble. They had no choice but to fight their way through, and there was no telling how this would end. Fletcher and Mrs. Thomas were too far gone, too entangled in their web of corruption. But Derek couldn't walk away from this. Not now. "You're right," he whispered back. "We're not backing down." He glanced at Tasha, who was already preparing herself. The sharp click of her gun's safety being released was the only sound that seemed to break the heavy silence. They were ready. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the quiet. One of the masked men had fired, but the bullet flew wide. Derek didn't wait to think. He moved swiftly, pulling Tasha along as they dashed toward a higher vantage point. The tension in the air was unbearable. The heart-stopping sense that the world was on the brink of imploding surrounded them. But Derek was no longer afraid. As they scrambled up to a catwalk above the warehouse floor, he saw the unmistakable gleam of Fletcher's eyes staring up at him, a mixture of rage and resignation in his gaze. The man had been holding the strings for so long, and now it was finally slipping from his grasp. "You're not the man I thought you were," Derek called down to Fletcher, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This isn't just about control. It's about your ego. And now, your ego's going to get you killed." Fletcher's eyes darkened. "You don't understand. You never did." "No," Derek replied, his voice cold. "I understand better than you think." The confrontation was almost unbearable, the weight of it hanging between them. Derek had spent so long trusting Fletcher, learning from him, believing in his vision. And now, that same man was his enemy, an enemy whose decisions had cost innocent lives. But it wasn't just about Fletcher anymore. Derek's mind flashed to his own life, his family, his community, and what they had lost. It wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. Suddenly, Tasha pulled him back from his thoughts, her voice urgent. "Derek, now's our chance." The men below were distracted, their attention momentarily diverted by a shout from the back of the warehouse. Derek didn't waste a second. He reached down, pulling a nearby barrel from the catwalk, sending it crashing to the floor below, creating a distraction. Tasha followed closely, already jumping to the next platform. In that moment, the chaos of the warehouse seemed to amplify. Gunshots firing, men yelling in panic, the sharp clank of metal against concrete. But amidst the chaos, Derek could feel the weight of what was happening, the unraveling of everything he had ever believed in. And then, in the midst of all that noise, the voice of Mrs. Thomas cut through, soft but deliberate. "This isn't how it was supposed to go." Derek turned, eyes locking with hers. Her expression was devoid of emotion, like a ghost caught between two worlds. It wasn't anger he saw in her face. It was regret. Regret for the choices she had made. Regret for the life she had chosen to live, even if it meant destroying the lives of others in the process. "It's over, Mrs. Thomas," Derek said, his voice final. "You've lost." For a brief moment, she seemed to falter, her eyes flickering with something deeper than mere remorse, something more primal. But then the coldness returned, and she leveled her gun at him. "Don't think this is over," she hissed. But before she could fire, another shot rang out, knocking the weapon from her hand. Derek turned in shock. Standing there, in the doorway of the warehouse, was none other than Agent Sloan. "Not quite," Sloan said, stepping forward, his expression unreadable. Derek's heart skipped a beat. You're with them." Sloan shook his head. "I was. Not anymore." The revelation hit like a ton of bricks. Sloan had been with the agency, involved in some of the darkest dealings Derek had ever uncovered. But it seemed the agent had made a change, perhaps not out of virtue, but necessity. It didn't matter. At this point, no one could be trusted. "What's going on?" Tasha asked, her voice sharp. Sloan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something close to vulnerability. "I didn't know how deep it went. I thought I could control it. Thought I could be a part of something bigger and survive. But this," he gestured around him, "this isn't survival. It's destruction." As the pieces fell into place, the full weight of the situation settled on Derek's shoulders. Everything had led to this. The manipulation, the lies, the destruction of trust, it all came to a head here in this warehouse. But there was still one final moment of reckoning. Fletcher stepped forward, his voice a low growl. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you and me. It's about power. It's about who gets to control the story, the narrative. It's about who decides who wins and who loses. And you. He looked Derek over, his gaze steely. You don't get to walk away from that. With that, a sudden silence fell over the room, the finality in Fletcher's words like the closing of a door. But Derek didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. The final confrontation was inevitable, and it was time for everything to end. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.